In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Rose Grenade. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion.
I can't say I'm a fan of this ink, though as a pink, it has a hard hill to climb with me. Not that I hate all pinks, it's just hard to get the right one. The tone is pleasant enough. It's not screaming or obnoxious. It does give some tone variation by pen and even offers up some shading depending on the pen and paper, though it does manage to shade some even on some non-fountain pen papers. I see this as a great pink for those wanting to add this to their supply. As long as the tone is for you, I can see a really good experience. It's just that this exact tone of pink, because pinks are so hard for me to nail down the ones I like the most, or that I want to use a bunch of, I have found a couple. It's just not for me. Not that there's anything wrong with it, it performs very well.
I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is an Aurora Optima with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the posting nib, it is incredibly light. And now this is a very fine and very dry writer, and that's bound to happen. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It doesn't shade until you look super close. Look at the top line, the word the. You see it. You see it in dyed. You see it in her on the second line. So there is a little bit of shading going through. Really hard to see with this nib. Looking at the arrow fine, it's quite a bit darker than we had with the posting nib. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's shading much better. The darker tone makes this where it's much easier to read. I don't know that I would feel like my eyes were bleeding if I had to read a whole page of this. I think it would do fairly well. Again, the shading is coming through pretty good. I'm fairly impressed with how it's doing. I was a little worried after the posting nib. Looking at the Architect nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get a tone that is a bit darker than we had in the Arrow Fine nib, which is good. This is a much better tone to be able to look at in what's going on. You really see the shading stand out with this nib. It does very nice. You see it in doing, in so, when, the, young even, starts much lighter and starts to get darker just at the G. So it's definitely showing shading in each word. Looking at the back of the page, there's no ghosting because it's such a light color and there's no bleed through.
To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Vac Mini with a posting nib, a TWSBI Eco with an Aero nib that is fine, a TWSBI Mini with an Architect, The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the posting nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. I think it's a little easier to read here, perhaps because the paper's not as bright a white. Now, it's not feathering. It's not spreading. We get a couple moments where you can see that it's shading. You see it in the H of Whip. You see it in the L of Euler's. You see it in Nicholas at the N, H, and L. So it actually is coming through quite nice on this paper. Looking at the Aero Fine, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the posting and much better to look at. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is still shading. It's doing it fairly well, in and out very regularly. Now, not every word is always coming up with a shading. On the second line, by, no shade, but directly underneath that, had, absolutely shading. Improved, absolutely shading. Finances, absolutely. So, really good match here. Looking at the Architect nib, it is roughly the same tone that we had with the Aero Fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. The shading is much more obvious here because of the wider nature of that nib than it was on the Aero Fine. And if it's shaded this obviously all the time, I don't understand why more people who like pink inks aren't looking at this. The tone's not for me, but it doesn't mean it's not a good ink. This is a great ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, we get back to that much lighter tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. A bit lighter than the last writing sample. Harder to read here. You can read it, it's just harder than the last paper. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. We are seeing some areas of shading in that some areas are much easier to read. I think a whole page of this would be a little bit too much to have to deal with, at least with this nib. Looking at the Aero Fine, it's quite a bit darker than we had with the posting. Thankfully, it is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is not shading. It is giving a good, solid, flat tone of pink, though. I think this one's doing fairly well here. I think this looks really nice as a tone. It's not obnoxious, it is easy to read, and it is definitely a pink. Good match with this nib. Looking at the Architect nib, it is just a little bit darker, I think, than the Aero Fine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading. Now, it's not shading a ton, but when it does it, it really does stand out. You see it in the H and of the S in mechanics. In published, second part on the second line, you see it on the H and D, so it's definitely there. Looking at the back of the page, the most noticeable thing is where it's shaded in the Architect is where the ink got deepest into the paper, though I think you could use the back of the page and there's no bleed through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the posting nib, it is about the same tone, maybe even a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Yet because it is not as bright a white of paper, it seems actually a little bit easier to read than it is on the Clairfontaine. I'm looking at them side by side here. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It technically has a few areas of shading. You see it in the H of French. You see it in he directly underneath it. So it's definitely there, just not standout. Looking at the Aerofine nib, quite a bit darker than the posting. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is definitely shading a bit more. You see it in the T of went. You see it in the ES of prizes. The or they on the second line starts light, gets darker at the H, and lightens up again. Walk starts lighter and gets darker. So it's shading fairly well here on this paper. Looking at the Architect nib, about the same tone that we had with the Aerofine. It's not feathering, not spreading. It is shading. Now, it shades here in certain areas, and it does make me a little weary after seeing how deep it got into the paper on the last book. So we're going to see if that happens again. I think this looks decent. Decent is being nice. It looked much better on the Aerofine, than this Architect. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no issues that we have to worry about.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Pink. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink. Here is J. Herbin Bouquet d'Antan. Here is J. Herbin Rule Dancer. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook.
Looking at the posting nib, it is probably the clearest you can see the posting nib of any of the papers. It does feather a tiny bit. It does spread a little bit. Both of those, I think, are actually aiding it with this paper. Technically, we see a couple of spots that have some shading where on the fourth line you're going to see required, and you're going to see it gets a bit darker to lighter to darker to lighter. It makes me worry if this is just going to bleed through in those spots. Looking at the Aerofine nib, darker than it was with the posting. Feathers very slightly, very, very slightly. Spreads just a little bit. Yeah, it becomes about a medium. It doesn't shade. It's a very flat pink here. I don't see any problem with the tone of the pink here. I just not too sure. Looking at the Architect nib, it actually looks just a little bit lighter than we had with the Aerofine. It has tiny feathers, totally manageable. It does spread a little bit. Very manageable. It does offer a couple spots that look like shading, which make me feel like they could be the spots that may bleed through and touch the page underneath, though that would be to tell. This paper's just not done well with fountain pens. You get about every other page. Looking at the page from underneath, you see that only in the Architect nib, where it shaded a couple spots, did it bleed through and touch that page underneath. You could use that page, I'm just used to not anymore. Now, the amount of ghosting, I don't think you could use the back of the paper at all, even with the posting nib.
While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here is a purple shimmering ink by Diamine, their Purple Pizzazz. Here is a gray ink by Pilot, their Iroshizuku Fuyu Sayugun, or Rigor of Winter. Here is a brown ink by Diatramentis Black Brown. Here is a black ink by Elixir Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the posting nib, it is a very easy to read pink here. It's doing, as a tone, it's very nice. There's the slightest bit of feathering. I'm not going to count it against it. Slightest bit of spread. I think it's helping it in this case. There's no shading. I think this is a fairly solid ink with this nib on this paper. Very dry, super fine. So for cheap paper, it's good. Looking at the Aerofine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the posting. It's feathered, it's spread, but both the feather and the spread are way under control. Not any kind of real issue. It looks like you're writing kind of with a medium on more premium paper. So just write a little bit larger and fast, and you probably aren't going to have a problem. Looking at the Architect nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we had with the Aerofine. It's feathering actually less than we see on the others, and they feathered very little. It's doing incredibly well, to be honest, on this paper. This spread is easily under control. Is there some moments of shading? Technically, you can find a couple of spots that are a little bit darker, though I wouldn't consider this shading on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, the really good news. The bleeding way under control. There's nothing touching the page underneath, barely any spots, almost no ghosting. You can easily use the back of this page as long as you're still using this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Dry and very fine pens might put down a tone that's too light to comfortably read, except on some of the poorer quality papers. Then it might become your friend. Now, I would go for a wet pen of any nib size. Just make sure that it is very wet. It's going to keep it dark enough to be able to see, and you're still going to get a bunch of that shading. Default back to, unless you're on very crappy paper, then a posting nib that's very dry might just be the thing. I don't know how many people really even have posting nibs.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.